All right, you guys. So, part two of our lecture today, we're going to be starting our look at the civil rights movement. So, first thing you're going to do is you're going to hit pause on here in just a minute, and then you're going to answer these two questions on your Google Doc. Number one is, what does it mean to be equal? To what extent were African Americans seen as equals before the civil rights movement? Hint there, think about various amendments and Reconstruction. I know that was a while ago, before all this, but just, think back, look through your notes, and just jot that down. Once you're done, hit resume and we'll get started here. Alright, so before the Civil Rights Movement, African Americans still were not treated or seen as equals by society. Okay, I think these two photos say all that really needs to be said. Alright, the KKK was still prevalent, especially, if you guys remember from our 1920s unit, 1920s were like the heyday of the KKK, right? 20s and early 30s. And while it diminished a bit from that point, it was still very present, especially in Southern society, although there was membership across the country. Lynchings still happened routinely in the South. African Americans were always a danger of being physically, at the very least verbally accosted, but usually physically accosted for doing things like, using the same water fountain as someone else, saying hi or whistling at a white woman, stuff like that. Okay, and then this photo here is very famous, and it shows kind of the impact of de jure or by law segregation. Right, there was a white water fountain, and then there's a colored water fountain, and it's very clear which one you'd want to drink out of if you had a choice. And it shows that it was not just the law, but it was also society. Right. The KKK was not de jure. It wasn't it was a technically legal group, but they were operating outside of the law, right, in many things that they did. And yet there was also the legal side of segregation, both of which made life very difficult for African Americans. Any sort of protests were met with harsh violence and punishment, right? Here we see some firefighters spraying down African American protesters during a peaceful protest with a fire hose, which would be very painful. And so even though the Civil War ended slavery, it didn't create full equality for African Americans. And so the Civil Rights Movement in 1965 onward, and even before that, 1950s and 60s, basically does what should have been done in the 1850s and 60s in the first sort of movement for civil rights. So why was it the 60s? Why did the 60s turn out to be the period in which civil rights were at least legally attained for African Americans? Well, there's a couple of reasons. I think number one, we start off with the Civil War, right? 1860s, that was, I wouldn't say the starting point, but one of the major early big stepping stones to get us closer, right? We have the new amendments, we have, Reconstruction, trying to bring African Americans into American society, right? And that gives us sort of the legal basis for equality with those 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, okay? Then we have westward expansion as African Americans are given the opportunity to move west, both in the 1800s as well as in the 1900s, right, for a variety of reasons. In the 1800s is, Homestead Act and just westward expansion in general. Then in the 1900s, we have the car becoming more ubiquitous, allowing people to move. We have the Dust Bowl forcing people to move. Then we have the rise of industry in California in the 1930s and 40s, giving people a chance to get out of the South and get a little bit further away from the history of slavery. Okay? We have Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which doesn't help out African Americans. It says that separate but equal is legal. But it creates a law that could be fought and defeated in order to create more equality. We have the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance in World War I, which we talked about, kind of creating new African American communities and culture outside of the South, which was important for creating new communities. We have World War II, creating new opportunities for African Americans, both as soldiers as well as working in the wartime industries. We have the 50s and the Cold War. The main thing in the 50s is television. TV kind of connected the country more, right? Because we started to see various parts of the country, various parts of society that previously wouldn't have been able to see before. For African Americans, right, in the 50s, they're seeing shows depicting the American dream, the white picket fence, right? And for a lot of them, it's like, hey, wait a second. That's what I want. Why am I not allowed to have that? And so it kind of, I think, gave people an an outlook or a look into the other side, what life could be, what life should be like, and give them something to fight for, right? Baseball and Jackie Robinson, this is very important, right? Sports are really important because, for a lot of people, like, I imagine most of you guys don't follow politics as closely as you follow sports, for many of you, right? I could argue I'm the same. I'm definitely the same. I care more about sports than politics. But when you're a kid and you love a sport, whether it be baseball or soccer, basketball, football, whatever, right? You look up to those who are good, those who you want to emulate, those who you want to be like. All right, Jackie Robinson being the first player to break the color barrier and play in the professional leagues, right, in the MLB, not the African American, the Negro leagues as they were called, and being the MVP, right? It wasn't just that he was like, it would have been one thing if he was the first player to play and he was like pretty good, but he was the MVP, right? He was really good. And so for anyone who liked baseball, black or white or whatever else, right, you wanted to be like Jackie Robinson. And that was a huge deal, right? Because it started to kind of bring African Americans into society as winners, as someone who you wanted to be like for people who weren't African American, and also gave role models for African Americans, right? In a time when there weren't that many African American role models because they weren't allowed to be role models. All right, same thing with like Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, right? Those people were huge. All right, so it begins with Brown v. Board, at least the change for de jure or by law segregation. So Plessy v. Ferguson said separate but equal was legal. Okay, you could restrict access to public facilities based on race or skin color as long as they're separate but equal. That's what it said in 1896. This applied to parks, restrooms, schools, beaches, whatever. Okay, and private businesses that offer public access, so like a restaurant. However, many groups started to fight this. Okay, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, created in the late 1800s, right? Florence Kelley, or 1909, sorry. Florence Kelley, W.B. Du Bois. They create the NAACP and they start to try to fight legal segregation through legal means, right? Using lawyers, fighting laws, fighting court decisions in order to try to break down the barriers that kept African Americans down. Okay? They tried to register voters, get people to vote, and to make their voices heard. And the Brown v. Board case, which we'll talk about in a second here, was coordinated by the NAACP in order to try to eliminate Jim Crow in education, or segregation in education. So what happens in Brown v. Board? All right. Well, we have Linda Brown, who was a black elementary student in Topeka, Kansas. Now, the closest school to her was an all-white school, and so she was forced to drive for a very long time, take a bus, to the inferior black school. Had less resources, had worse teachers, didn't have books. She was forced to go to a worse school, get a worse education, okay? Because she was not allowed to go to the local school, which was all white, which was closer to her, okay? So this case, eventually, through the efforts of the NAACP, eventually reached the Supreme Court in 1954. So when we get to the Supreme Court actually surprisingly overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. They said, okay, yes, equal, separate but equal. However, this is not ever truly going to be equal, right? You can't have anything that's separate and equal. And also said that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. It basically said that segregation deprived blacks of equal education, and therefore it was not legal. Separate could not be equal because segregation lowered morale and motivation for black students. And so this Supreme Court case kind of starts to end de jure or legal segregation. Now, in response to this, Southerners did not go quietly, those who supported segregation, okay? 80% of Southern whites opposed the Brown decision. Eisenhower, while not being necessarily in favor of segregation, was also not in favor of helping desegregation. And so he didn't really do much at first to help desegregate the schools. These new integrated schools, in which both black and white were allowed, many white students refused to even attend those schools. And then the KKK reemerged in the South to kind of prevent desegregation or integration from happening. Lynchings, murders, intimidation, terrorism towards black, African Americans, and civil rights workers and advocates. All of this was done in order to prevent integration from happening. We then have the story of Governor Faubus versus President Eisenhower. Now, in Little Rock, Arkansas, the Governor Faubus wanted to prevent the integration of the schools, and so he used the National Guard, the state militia, to prevent the schools from integrating. Okay? Eisenhower, at first, didn't want to intervene. Again, he didn't want to take a side because politicians are like that, right? They're like, oh, well, this is the right thing to do, but I might lose some votes, so I'm not going to do it. You know, that's what politics is, ultimately. And so Ike, as he was called, Eisenhower, basically met with Faubus and said, okay, are we good? Can you let it happen? And he thought that he had convinced him. But in reality, when he removed the National Guard, he essentially let this mob form. Now, at this point, we had the Little Rock Nine. These 9 black students who were the first to integrate in Little Rock. This mob formed, and the students had to be basically escorted out of there to be kept safe. All right? Here we see some photos of the students being chased by the mob. Eisenhower then, angry that Faubus basically defied him, then sent in the National Guard, nationalized the National Guard, and sent in the 101st Airborne to protect the black students. And for the entire school year, the 9 black students at the Little Rock School they each had their own personal soldiers following them around, protecting them from class to class in order to try and allow them to just attend a school. As you can see, this was, ridiculous, right? But this is what African Americans had to go through in order to try to fight for equality. Now, 1957 ends. Okay, this is 57. 57 ends, the school year ends, and then Faubus basically says to the Congress of Arkansas and says, all right, new law, we're just closing all the public high schools, and then we're going to rent out those public high schools to private schools, and private schools are allowed to decide who gets to go and who doesn't. And so essentially reforcing segregation, right? And it basically prevented African Americans going to schools again. The new school, which was previously opened up, Central High School for the Little Rock Nine, was now called T.J. Rainey High School. Even though it was the same building, same location, same everything, it was now technically a private high school, and only white students could go. And then later, these laws were overturned in courts because they were in defiance of the Supreme Court. Okay, but as we can see here, there was a lot of attempts to try to circumvent desegregation. While the laws changed, the reality of segregation didn't change, right? Laws can change, but that doesn't matter if people's minds don't change. And so civil rights activists shifted efforts to direct action, right? Direct protest rather than trying to fight laws indirectly. Okay? So we have things like sit-ins, right? Where you go to a restaurant which didn't allow African Americans to sit in certain places, and you would sit there, right? Or at stores, and then you get arrested on purpose, and you go peacefully. And these were all done as sort of peaceful protests in order to try and show to the country, because these things would be on the news, right? Show to the country the challenges that people were facing and the injustices that people were facing. Okay, the Freedom Rides. So there was a boycott of so the Freedom Riders, right? There's people coming in from the north, riding into the south in order to try and basically protest against segregation, right? Challenging segregation on public transport. People would get on buses in the north, Greyhound buses, and take them into the south where segregation was enforced, and then refuse to get off or just get arrested and therefore, peaceful protest. This was met with violence. Boycotts, right? So we have the Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks and stuff like that, right? You have people, they're like, hey, we're not going to ride the bus anymore. We're going to just carpool together and we're going to walk places, and not going to places that supported segregation, using financial incentives, essentially, or hurting a company's finances by boycotting their products or their services. And then marches, right, which were a huge part of the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement, again, is designed to be peaceful, because for African Americans, they had to be peaceful during this time, because it was the only way they could gain the sympathy of the world and of the country and the public. Okay, so we're done with that. What I'd like you guys to do on your Google Doc is assess the validity of the following statement. The Brown v. Board decision ended both de jure and de facto segregation in schools. Again, de jure being by law, de facto being sort of by practice. Okay, so answer that question in a paragraph, and you guys are done for today. All right, take it easy.